Outside the Vatican, a major correction for one of the nation's biggest legacy newspapers. The New York Times issued a correction after showing an emaciated child displayed on its front page as evidence of famine in Gaza. The paper issued an editor's note saying the child is suffering from a grim pre-existing condition unrelated to the conflict with Israel. The original caption on the photo noted that the boy was born healthy. Meanwhile, the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza rages on, and you can see here large crowds collecting aid. This after days of intensified international pressure on Israel to increase the flow of aid into the Gaza Strip. The Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, a global partnership on food security and malnutrition, claims the worst-case scenario of famine is playing out in Gaza. Matti Friedman, author of the Aleppo Codex and journalist for the Free Press, joins us now from Jerusalem to talk more about the situation in Gaza. Matti, thank you so much for being with us. You just wrote a piece that named the media coverage of the situation in Gaza an information war. And you focus on an event that happened just a few weeks after the horrific October 7th attack 2 years ago. Tell us about that moment.
That was a reference to an attack or a supposed attack on a hospital in Gaza called the El Ahli Hospital. The war was quite new at the time. Of course, we were kind of reeling from what had happened on October 7th, which was this attack across the Israeli border that killed 1,200 people in Israel and took 250 hostages. And a few weeks later, there was an attack that was reported globally on a hospital in Gaza. It was a front page headline in the New York Times saying that more than killed by Israel at this hospital. And the story was fake. The hospital was intact. A Palestinian rocket had landed nearby. But the story was not as it had been reported. And it was a good reminder for many of us here that a lot of the information coming out of Gaza is part of an information war that's designed to sway public opinion globally in order to tie Israel's hands and make it easier for Israel's opponents to win. It's been going on for years and years. I was a reporter for the AP, the Associated Press, about 15 years ago and saw it almost on a daily basis. I think many news consumers in the West are still a bit naive about it. That's not to say that there isn't a real humanitarian crisis. That isn't to say that civilians are not being harmed. In many cases, they are. But stories reported from here need to be taken often with a grain of salt, and almost no information that comes out of Gaza can be taken at face value.
Now, President Trump did go ahead and say that he was going to send aid and that he only trusted Israeli forces to distribute that aid. Do you have an update on that at all, whether that will happen and maybe alleviate this crisis in one way or another?
I haven't heard any new developments on the American aid plan. What I do know from people who are involved in this directly is that the problem is not primarily that there is not enough aid inside the Gaza Strip. So even a week ago, when the headlines about an impending famine really crescendoed, there were incredible photographs of hundreds and hundreds of pallets of food waiting inside Gaza. The problem is distribution inside the Gaza Strip. So it's not enough to get food to Gaza. You need to be able to get it to people who are hungry, and that is very difficult because Gaza is an active war zone. Swaths of the territory are destroyed. Hamas has fought this war from behind civilians and from under civilians. Hamas fighters are indistinguishable from civilians, so it makes it very tricky for the Israeli army to know who's who. And the society in Gaza, I think it's fair to say, is in a state of advanced collapse after 2 years of war, with Hamas refusing to surrender and refusing to return the hostages. So getting the aid from the entry points to the smaller distribution points is very, very tricky. When the trucks go in, they often get looted on the way to where they're going, not necessarily by malevolent actors or by terrorists, but by hungry people who see a truck of food driving by their house and they decide to loot the truck. There's a tremendous food insecurity in Gaza. Even if there isn't mass starvation, there's definitely food insecurity, there's malnutrition, and there are people who are hungry. And in that state of affairs, it's very difficult to move aid around. What we're seeing now is Gaza being flooded with aid dropped from the air, brought in through the entry points. The Israeli army has declared essentially unilateral ceasefires, which they're calling humanitarian pauses, basically a 10-hour pause in fighting so that the aid trucks can get in and get people fed. It is being addressed. I think our government made a huge mistake in the way they've dealt with it. They should have seen this coming a long time ago. They should never have allowed it to reach this point. The fact that we're fighting incredibly cynical terrorists like Hamas, people who have no concern whatsoever for the welfare of their own civilians, in fact, who see the suffering of their civilians as a weapon. That's just a fact of this war. We can't expect Hamas to have mercy on their own civilians. We are going to have to do it. Israel's going to have to decide how far it wants to push this and when it needs to stop. And I think that our government really miscalculated in that regard. And we're seeing the effects right now.
Just your last thought. You seem very clear-eyed about both the virtues and the failings of this war. Do you think that there is an end in sight or possible permanent ceasefire?
I think there is. I think it's quite clear that the Israeli leadership thought there would be a ceasefire about 3 or 4 weeks ago after the Iran war was wrapped up and Netanyahu came to Washington, met with President Trump, and we had the contours of a ceasefire that everyone assumed was about to happen. By the way, I think that's part of what happened with the aid here. One of the reasons that it wasn't taken seriously as a problem that was about to become acute is that people assumed about a month ago that the war would be wrapped up, at least for a while, and that didn't happen, in part because Hamas walked away from the talks, and that happened in part because they felt that their international position has been strengthened when the headlines again kind of came to a crescendo on Friday about famine in Gaza. Hamas was empowered and they walked away from the ceasefire talks in Qatar. So I think the Israeli leadership understands that in the cost-benefit analysis, Israel is losing much more in this war than it's gaining.
Well, we look forward to more updates and, of course, peace and the return of the hostages. Thank you so much for your time, Matti.
Thank you again for having me.